One of the most fascinating things that I discovered was the oldest fairy tale is 6,000 years old.
We're in the mature stage of the podcast, but in the beginning stage of these book projects that the podcast was seeking to serve. So starting your podcast before you started your book projects was intentional because that was your research.
Yes.
That's the beauty of implementation. If you didn't edit your own podcast, if you didn't struggle through all these different hurdles, you wouldn't have the benefit of understanding how they work so that you can then hire the right person.
My main message is not to be scared. It's scary to try new things and it's scary to take on these grand projects, but I think it's worth it. So just do it.
Vanessa Rogers, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hey, well, I am a mom of 3 crazy children. And then I started podcasting about 2 years ago when my youngest was 1. And in fact, my very first podcast interview where I was speaking to her mid-interview, my youngest, who was being watched by my aunt, actually turned off the internet at the wherever it's being plugged in. And so I had to go and investigate and we had to get back on. It was a whole thing. So my very first episode was interrupted by my current chaos goblin. And I have a podcast called Fabric of Folklore where I interview guests all about folk tales and fairy tales and culture from all over the world. So I interview historians, folklorists, storytellers, folk musicians, and then I also do a once a month fairy tale flip where I have a co-host and we look at one fairy tale. Sometimes we'll do a Greek mythology or we'll branch into different realms of storytelling. And we flip it on its head and look at its hidden messages and its context and the history and its intended meaning. And so it's a really fun, nerdy podcast for people who really like to nerd out.
That's so fun. And it's folklore. So take us back to the beginning of the podcast. Why did you start the podcast? What was your big motivation? Because we have a lot of people who are listening who want to start a podcast.
Yeah, so I had two main motivations. I had always actually wanted to do a podcast. My major in college was communication studies, and in high school I was in theater, so I always really felt comfortable speaking in front of people. There's always stage fright, but I always enjoyed being in front of a camera or being in front of an audience. And I felt like I had something to bring, but I just couldn't really settle on what I wanted to talk about. And at one point I started writing books for my kids. Partially, I've always enjoyed writing. And so when my oldest was first starting to stay in his room and he was having a hard time staying in, my thought was maybe if I had some stories that I wrote for him that I would put on audio, if it was about him, he would be more interested and be more willing to stay in his room. That was the thought. And so I was writing stories just for him and I would record them on GarageBand on my Mac and then I would pipe them into his room and he did really enjoy them, but he did still come out of his room quite frequently. That was not the panacea that I thought it was going to be. So anyways, I started writing stories for him and then I started writing some stories for friends, children, and I really started to enjoy learning about folk tales. And I got this idea that I wanted to write a book series around a mystery that had to do with folk tales. And I knew that was going to require quite a bit of research. And so I was thinking about how I would do that and do the marketing as well. And I thought it would be really great if I could have something that had touched both of those elements, the marketing and the research. And so I thought a podcast might be the perfect avenue. So I could have guests on that I would interview about different folk tales and about different folklore. And then I would also have a way to tell the world that I was writing a book. But the problem with podcasting is it requires a lot of time. And I really enjoy every minute of it. And I really love the podcasting element and the research element, but it really made my writing be the back burner. And so I haven't actually got any of my projects done because I have put so much focus into my podcasting. So right now, if people go on my podcast, they'll see that I haven't put out an interview for several months because I decided to actually get some projects done and then restart the podcast full force after that.
So the podcast was a way for you to focus on your building research for your book?
Yes.
That was the main purpose of creating a podcast, was research. So most people don't share their research. They'll do research privately. They don't make it a public podcast. But you said, no, I want to make this public.
Yeah. I thought it would be more fun to see the project.
Yeah. And so you're interviewing mainly folklore people? Who are you interviewing on your podcast?
All sorts of people. So I have interviewed folklorists, which is a word that I only learned after I got into folklore. Folklorists are people who study folklore. But as I was telling you prior to us talking, when I named my podcast, I really did not know the extent of what folklore encompassed. So I thought folklore was synonymous with folk tale. I thought that, lore just means tale or story. And so I thought that it was just that. But really, folklore is an umbrella term that really encompasses anything to do with oral storytelling. So that can be the recipe that your grandmother showed you in the kitchen as you were growing up, but that didn't necessarily have it written down. That is family folklore. It can be songs or it can be material goods, folklore that has been passed on. So anything that is being passed on from generation to generation. And also folklore doesn't have to be old. It can be new. So there's a whole new branch of folklore that includes internet folklore, memes, and how we start off an email and end an email. All the ins and outs of what happens on the internet and blooms into things. Slender Man is one of the most famous versions of folklore that originated from the internet because it started off from a forum, a question that was given to someone, and then people started submitting things, and it just kind of blew up from there and has now become this massive franchise. Folklore can be really old, but it can also be new. It just has to be organic, basically. It's not given from the top down. It comes bottom up.
My understanding was it's from the people, the folk, literally. I didn't realize and I didn't think about the newness of folklore because I too always thought of it as older. What are some other surprising things that you've found in this journey?
So storytelling is one of the most important elements of humanness. I think it's really what makes us human. In fact, some people call us the storytelling animals. I had an author come on and he basically, what was his name? Something Kindle. I'll look it up afterwards. He wrote basically the science behind storytelling and how critical it is to how we pass on messages to one another. And I've just been really struck with the beauty behind how humans interact through storytelling. And that also includes songs. A lot of songs come from the people and then continuously are passed down. A lot of the lullabies and nursery rhymes are incredibly old. One of the most fascinating things that I discovered was the oldest fairy tale is 6,000 years old. That's The Smith and the Devil, which predates Gilgamesh. It's in the same time period. Rumpelstiltskin, which is probably more well known by most people, is 4,000 years old. I mean, that is incredible that story that is still being told on a daily basis to children, that our children still know the story, is thousands of years old. I'm just incredibly struck by that.
You mentioned Kendall Haven, was it?
Yes, that was his name, Kendall Hayden.
I read that book feels like a long time ago. What other kinds of guests have you had on your show? Because I know Kendall Haven has a wonderful book on storytelling and specifically the science of storytelling. And I can't wait to listen to that episode.
So I love science. I really love Science Friday and all things science. So I try and find all areas where I can get folklore and science to mesh. So I've had a couple of scientists come on. I had a neuroscientist, Patrick McKinney, maybe. I'm bad with remembering names. And he studies dreams, and he also studies the science of, what was it? Now I'm blanking on that discussion, but religion. That's what it was. And basically religious experience, spiritual experiences, and what that looks like in the brain and what the person describes as their experience. And so I also had a guest that was a biology teacher, and he has a book about all the cryptids in Maine. And it's a really interesting book that he wrote because it's kind of written like a field guide to different creatures that you might find in the wooded areas. And so he would interview huntsmen and woodsmen and just all sorts of people from all walks of life, and came up with this guide. But one of the questions I asked him was, how do you come to terms with folklore seems so fantastical and science is so rooted in logic? And he said that he felt like they actually go well together, especially in the way that he thinks about the natural world. Anyway, so I really like to find those intersections where people don't necessarily think that they would go together, but they find avenues.
We can hear your passion and your curiosity for this topic. What are some of the challenges that you had as you started your podcast and started digging deeper into folklore?
Well, starting a podcast is very overwhelming. There's so many different things that you have to do, especially in today's internet world where people want to be able to find you in all the different areas. They want to be able to find you on the social media platforms. They want to be able to see your website. You need to be able to have a place where it's being hosted. And I made a lot of different mistakes along the way, and I'm still making mistakes. But one of the things that you'll find people say on podcasting forums is the best thing to do is just start and continue to learn from your mistakes, and you'll get better. Because if you are waiting for perfection, you're never going to do it. I was really lucky, and I found someone who wanted to be a podcast manager or producer. And so he kind of offered to hold my hand during the process and help me along the way as kind of a way for him to build up his portfolio. And so I had someone who was willing to help me along that journey, which really propelled me faster. And so I would recommend you find anyone who would be willing to hold you accountable or just like answer your questions or be helpful along the journey, because I found that incredibly helpful.
That's awesome. Having someone able to help you as a podcast producer. Most people don't have that luxury. What are some of the tips and tricks that you learned when you were first starting out?
So one of the big hurdles that I thought I was going to face was finding people to actually come on my show, because I was reaching out to academics and people who were well educated. I didn't want people who were just like frou-frou. I've had a lot of people reach out to me that I didn't feel like had knowledge. They didn't have the historical knowledge, or they just had their thoughts. I wanted people who had done serious research into their topics. And so people who took themselves seriously, I was afraid wouldn't be willing to come on my show. And so I was really afraid to reach out to people, especially having a brand new podcast that has no record. People were very willing to come on this show, especially academics. I find academics are the most willing and easy to come on. For one thing, they like to talk. They like to talk about their subject matter, and they didn't really seem to care what my audience size was. And so that was a lot easier than I imagined. Now, a lot of people say no. You have to expect people to say no. I would say I would get probably about 50% of people said yes, of the people I reached out to. And from that, I would get ghosted about 25% of the time. So that is just par for the course. And making sure that if someone agrees to come on your show, making sure that you're continuously reaching out to them and saying, yes, I'm looking forward to you coming on the show. I'm just confirming this time. One time I had a guest come on and I had, confirmed. I had made my calendar event, sent it out to her, and then I didn't reach back out to her. And when the time came, she never showed up. And when I reached back out to her, she said, I just didn't think that we were doing it because I never heard from you after that. And I said, oh, well, it was in my calendar and I confirmed with you, but she needed an extra confirmation. And so sometimes that is needed. So you just have to expect there to be no's, and you have to expect there to be some ghosting because some people just aren't going to be reliable, and that's okay. You just move on.
I know that sometimes we get over-reliant on preparation, over-reliant on maybe a set of questions or something like that. Did you start with a set of questions? You do a deep dive into research, or you just let your curiosity guide you in the moment?
No, I am not an off-the-cuff person. I'm not good with talking off the cuff. Some people are. Some people are really good at just talking. I'm not. I really need the research. So I usually do 2 to 3 hours of research per interview because I really wanted to understand my guest history and what their research encompassed. And I want to be able to ask the deeper questions because if you go in without prior knowledge, and sometimes people just have a depth of knowledge that they just have on their own. And so they're able to ask deep questions without that research, then great. That's fantastic. But I'm not capable of that. I really have to have the depth in order to get under that surface level. So I don't really just want surface level answers. I want to get it down into the nitty-gritty details, which is not for everybody, but that's what I'm interested in.
So take us through your research process. Do you have a specific process as you dive into a guest interview?
So it really depends on who I'm interviewing. If I'm interviewing someone with a book, then I will ask them if they can send me the book, or if I have access to it on the library, then I'll research it on the library. But a lot of times if it's an academic book, then they need to send me the papers, and I won't necessarily read the whole book, but I'll read like several introduction. I'll read the introduction, the foreword, maybe the first couple chapters, and that will give me enough groundwork because a lot of times my interviews, I wanted them to be about 45 minutes, but because I like to get into the nitty gritty, it's hard to stop asking questions. And so a lot of times my interviews end up going an hour 20. That's probably the longest I'll go. An hour 20, an hour 30 is the longest I'll go because then listeners, they have an attention span that stops. Although there is, I think, Joe Rogan kind of broke that myth in a lot of ways because Joe Rogan has, his podcast goes up and down, but a lot of times it's number one on Spotify. His podcast will sometimes go 4 hours and people will listen. So I would say that people have a longer attention span when they have something to do with their hands. I'm a huge believer in audio. I only listen to audiobooks at this point in my life just because I have a lot of things to do. Being a mom of 3 children, I am always busy. I don't really have a lot of time to just sit and read a book, but I can do chores and listen to a book. And so I think now that the audio world is coming more alive, people are more willing to listen to longer form.
After you finish your research part, when you're actually in the moment doing the implementation of that research in your guest interviews, what are some tips you might have for our audience or advice for our audience to have a really good interview?
Well, there's a lot, especially when you're nervous, there is an inclination just to go straight off of the questions that are on your sheet. And a lot of times I will have a page or 2 of questions and I will really only get to a fourth of them because really what is important is that you're listening and reacting to what the person is saying and continuing the conversation, because what your audience is wanting is a real true interaction, not just your question after question after question. At least that's what I want. They say in improv, the key to good improv is the yes and, right? You always want to be continuing in that world that the first person has started creating. You don't stop it and move on to something else when you're still in that place where you're trying to create. Otherwise, you're kind of breaking the rhythm, if that makes sense.
Do you have any other keys to stay in the moment? Because I know a lot of people get drawn into that question list and it becomes very robotic. And it's not their fault because they have questions they want to ask. And I get that. And I certainly started with question lists. And I was like, how can I make my question list better? And let me fine tune this question list the best way possible. So how do you stay in the moment?
It's hard. It's really hard because there are things that you absolutely want to get to. And so as you're listening to the person, you're trying to think like, how much time do I have left? And how can I get to this question that I really wanted to answer? And how can I move them from rambling about this topic into talking about something that I really want them to talk about? And you don't also want to be rude, because sometimes I found myself like interrupting too many times. So it's really a balance. It's really hard to find that balance. And I think it really just takes practice and time. And I personally like to take notes. So I like to take notes and like jot down things that they say that I want to come back to, because I want to give them the time to flesh out what they're trying to say. And sometimes it takes a longer time than you really want to give them, but they need that time to talk. And so I kind of write down things that I want to come back to. And if I came back to everything, then the conversation would be like a Joe Rogan episode where it'd be 4 hours. But you just have to pick and choose. And then you have to, it's just kind of in the moment. But like trying to stay in the moment, it is very difficult, because you're trying to work out how to make the best show, how to get to the questions that you really want answered. But you also want to give them the time and the space to answer the questions that they want to pass on.
And consider your audience, right? So who is your target audience, your persona, and how did you build that persona?
So my target audience is typically women. I find that people are gravitated towards, I personally am gravitated to listening to other women. I don't know if there's any scientific studies that have shown that, but I find that my audience is primarily women. There are men who listen to my episodes as well. They're older, usually 30 to 60 range, and they are college educated, because I'm asking the deeper level questions. I'm asking the nerdy questions. So if it's people who are really interested in diving deeper than just understanding like basic level things.
Yeah, story nerds. And that's how we met. We're both story nerds. We both now serve on the San Antonio board. Welcome again. We're so happy to have you. It's an organization very deeply embedded in my heart. I used to serve as president, and I just love the people who are in the San Antonio Storytellers. And you gravitated to that organization in part because you too are a lover of stories and oral storytelling. And in that kind of organization, you have a huge benefit of networking. And in podcasting, you have a huge benefit of networking. Can you talk about some of the benefits to having a network through your podcast, or building a network through your podcast, professionally and personally?
I think that, just saying I have a podcast, although a lot of people will have a podcast and like, some people will just say, oh, it's just, a little thing. But saying that you have a podcast gives you a little bit of clout. It gives you something to talk about, and people are more willing are interested in coming to talk to you, because you have done something that a lot of people want to do and have talked about doing, but you have actually taken the hard steps to make it your dream a reality. And even if that reality is not as big as you necessarily want, sometimes it just takes time. And I have to remind myself of that as well. Just putting in the hard work and continuing to do what it is I'm passionate about. The bigness, I believe, comes with time and practice. And I think that having a platform makes people see you in a different light. It puts you up on a bit of a pedestal, because then you have a way to speak to more people than are just in your immediate sphere, right? Because my audience is not just in San Antonio, Texas, where I live. It's worldwide. I have audience members in every single continent except for Antarctica. I think there's only scientists in Antarctica, and I don't know if they listen to many podcasts, but I have listeners in every single continent of the world, and that's really amazing. And so it's a way to speak to people that you wouldn't necessarily have.
That kind of reach. What a wonderful world we live in, to be able to say that we can make something and share that, not just with our little community, not with just our village as we were bound to in the past, but with the entire world. And that really bridges this idea of 6,000, 4,000-year-old stories that are a part of your topic matter. And today, where we can share those stories in a much easier platform, in a much easier way. Have you seen benefits that came to you professionally from having a podcast beyond the network and growing that network?
That people are impressed that I've had a podcast for so long. A lot of people start a podcast, and you'll see this when you go through podcasting online. I think what they say is 10 is kind of the number that a lot of people will stop at, that they get frustrated at their lack of growth, at their lack of progress, or their lack of ideas, or how much time it takes. Because it is very time consuming. When I was doing it weekly, one of the reasons I put a pause on it, it was taking about 20 hours a week. It's a lot of time that I was putting into my podcast because I was doing a lot of research, and the interviews take time, and then putting it up on social media. If you can hack it, getting a virtual assistant is very helpful. I definitely recommend that, because then you can kind of divide and conquer.
After you've shot the podcast, you have the footage, you're ready to edit. Can you tell us some of the things that you've found that save you time? Because as you said, it's a time-intensive process.
It is. I have a little bit of experience prior to messing around in iMovie, because I have a Macintosh, and so that automatically comes with GarageBand, and it came with iMovie, and so that was really nice because that was already built into my computer, whereas non-Macintosh computers don't have that. And those programs are really easy to use, I find. I'm currently using a program called Descript, and it's a new platform what you're able to not only edit what you've done, but it also has AI tools that can fix little minor things, like it can shorten speech gaps, and it can correct words, and it can correct eye contact, all sorts of different things. But I find that the editing tools are so much harder to figure out than it was in iMovie. And so there's always changes in all of these programs that you're constantly having to keep up with. So there's always people who are reaching out to me that are saying, I will do all your editing for you. And absolutely, if you have the money to do that, because that is a very time consuming process. But also know that you probably need to know some basics, because if that person ghosts you or disappears from your life, you need to be able to figure that out pretty quickly. So even if you can just do it in a rudimentary process. Originally, I had someone who was helping me, and then he had some things that happened in his life, and then he wasn't able to help anymore, and I had to take over that process, and that ended up, taking a lot of time. And so I used StreamYard originally before they upped their prices to outrageous prices, and it also did local recording, so that if anything happened to my internet, as it did many times, I had the local recording, which meant it didn't have all the breakups and distortions. And then I could download it and use iMovie, although it is very limited in what it's able to do. But if you just want to get something out and put it out into the world, even if it's not perfect, I recommend doing that. I personally use YouTube, and I use podcasting audio platforms. I think that YouTube works really well as a discovery tool. So I put my entire episodes out, but I also use shorts for people to be able to find my podcast, because I don't think that people use YouTube to watch as long form as much as they do in audio form. Although now that it's able to stream to TVs, that might be changing. So I think now that people are able to watch YouTube on television, that might change. Everything's always changing and growing. So yes, I usually will take the audio from the video, but you can also just download the audio directly. And then I use Buzzsprout personally to upload. And originally I was using my website as the hosting. And I learned that from the hard way that using your website to host is a bad idea for podcasts, because especially if you have a viral episode, it can crash your website if you don't have the large enough package. And so I would not recommend it. I would definitely recommend using a hosting platform like Buzzsprout, or there's lots of them, Lisbon. And I think they basically all do the same type of thing. And then I think having a website is really important, although my website is currently down because it got hacked. Fixing it has been this huge hurdle. And I used Ionos as my hosting platform, and I used WordPress.org to build it. But Ionos only goes so far in maintaining the website from viral attacks. And so I'm currently in the process of trying to move hosting companies to one that is better about keeping the line on websites. But these are all things that you constantly have to deal with. It's not something I think that people need to worry about in the beginning, but as things come up, these are just things that you have to try and fix. So I'm constantly in fixing mode. Hopefully some people are better about setting the groundwork. But I think these are all things that you just learn through the process.
And that's the beauty of implementation. If you didn't edit your own podcast, if you didn't struggle through all these different hurdles, you wouldn't have the benefit of understanding how they work so that you can then hire the right person if you ever could monetize. Let's talk about monetization. Are you looking to monetize your podcast?
I am, but there are two different avenues that you can go with monetization. Right. So the two main avenues you can go is you can get your podcast to a large enough size so that you get sponsors. And usually those large enough sizes are at least 100,000, I think, is the number that people look at. And then the other monetization, subscribers or listeners. The other avenue is use it as a marketing branch to sell your own things. You still need large audiences for that, but not as large. Right. So those are the two divergent ways that people can monetize their podcast, and they have different ways of going towards them, I think. And so my personal goal is to use it as a marketing branch rather than one to get sponsorships, because I don't know that, maybe my podcast would be interesting enough to enough nerds to hit 100,000, but it's not at that point right now. But I think that even with having a small podcast, you can reach enough people to sell things through smaller audiences. And so when I'm listening to monetization for different podcasting avenues, that's the two divergent ways that I hear people talking about it. Is that what you teach in your class?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because the other course that I teach in our program for digital communication influence is AI and personal branding. So it's a beautiful segue into what we're teaching in that class, which also includes podcasting as a part of that personal brand. Just as you described having the website and having these other kinds of ways of getting your message out there, your social media. And I'm curious, in your personal branding experience, you've had a lot of challenges, it sounds like. You had your website go down, you've been hacked.
My Facebook as well. My personal Facebook got attacked, and it was 20 years old. My Facebook account got taken down. And so I had to restart one, even though I fought with Facebook to have it reinstated. And so my actual Facebook Fabric of Folklore is attached to my old one, which I cannot get into. And so I've just been kind of holding on to hope that eventually they'll reinstate my old one and I'll be able to get into that one, but they haven't so far.
Hey, that's a great lesson. That's a great challenge and a great lesson in that we don't want to be dependent on one specific platform. We often use the language own versus rent. You own your website, you rent on social platforms in terms of audience share of voice.
And social media is so fickle. You hear YouTubers talk all the time about, even huge YouTubers will have their platform taken down for seemingly nothing. Reasons that are nothing. There's one person I follow, I think she's called Fashion Hippie. She talks about silly fashion trends and basically she makes fun of them, and she's very funny, but she's a bigger girl with a bigger chest size, and YouTube said that she was lewd because of her large chest size. And basically they took her platform down, and she fought it and she fought it. And after a month of fighting with YouTube, they gave it back to her, and they realized that their reasoning was not sound, but it made her really realize that people who completely depend on YouTube for their entire income, if that's your full stream, you're in trouble, because you really need diversification, and especially with social media, because you don't own any of your social media platforms. They can turn on a dime at any moment of time.
Absolutely. And that's part of what we're teaching, is we're trying to make sure that we own more of our voice rather than renting space for our voice. It's so interesting, the challenges that you've presented here, because I can imagine people listening thinking, oh no, I could get hacked. Oh no, I could get taken down. These aren't things that people usually think about whenever they're trying to get into this space. Your personal brand is about storytelling. Your personal brand is about folklore. What kinds of offerings do you plan to give the world?
I'm working on publishing a couple of children's books. They're all going to be children's books, but some of them are going to be aimed at the 4 to 8-year-olds. So think picture books, but they're going to be around folklore. One of them is around the song "I'm Bringing Home a Baby Bumblebee." You know that old song. It's a very old song. Personally, when I read books to my younger children, they loved the songbooks and they loved any song that had a song in it. And so I gravitated towards finding those books, which are not, there's not a whole lot of them. And so I really am going to put out several of those types of books that are around old folklore songs. And you don't necessarily think of that as a folklore song, but it's a very old song. And it has a lot of different versions, and a lot of people have changed the versions, and that's okay, right? That's what folklore is. And so I also am putting out a book about this little rhyme that my great grandma would do, and it's not super well known. William Trimbletoe is an old rhyme. It's a game as well. And I kind of really want to maintain these and bring them back. And a lot of these kids, they'll play these little rhyming games that we played when we were kids. But this one seems to kind of have gone into old fashionedness. And I want to see if I can bring it back because it was really wonderful as a child. And I think that it needs to be brought into the light once more. And then I also am going to do some chapter books that are around folk tales, but we'll be telling a folk tale with some pictures. I don't know, your kids, you have a 9-year-old, so do they read Dragon Masters or Magic Tree House? Yeah, so it's in the vein of those type of books. So they're shorter chapter books that are meant for earlier readers. They still have some pictures in them, and they're going to have some characters that go throughout the entire series, but they're going to be kind of diving into different folk tales. I'm going to start in Texas because that's where I am. That's where my roots are. But then I'm going to go around the US and around the world. And I want to look a little bit about the history and the context. Obviously, I'm not going to go quite as in depth as I would if I was talking to adults, but I want children to understand how beautiful these stories are, that they're so old and they've continuously being passed down, and what that means to us today.
So your core offer is for moms, dads, grandmas, people with kids, mainly women though, because that's your core persona audience. And the way that you're speaking to them is by, in part, interviewing storytelling experts before you actually produce your own books. And that's sharing of the journey is part of marketing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I really think that the more we share about ourselves and our vulnerabilities, the more honest we can be, and how people are more willing to be honest with you.
And you mentioned you had a podcast producer, a podcast coach.
I know he doesn't help me anymore, but he did for the first year.
Okay, he did for the first year. And you've been podcasting for over 2 years now. We're in the mature stage of the podcast, but in the beginning stage of these book projects that the podcast was seeking to serve. So starting your podcast before you started your book projects was intentional because that was your research.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I wanted to have a strong foundation in what I was going to be talking about and passing on.
Yeah. I'm thinking of when my kids were younger and the kinds of things that we did with them. My wife teaches first grade, so I still sometimes get little pieces and bits of this. But like, for example, we're going on a bear hunt was huge. That was a great, fun song. And we have other little ones like that we're able to share. What you're creating and what you're intending to create would be family stories that kids can grow up with. What are some of the angles and considerations that you have to have in your mind as you seek to articulate those kinds of stories?
Well, it has to fall within the non-copyright, right? So it has to be old enough so that I can work with it. And some of those stories are younger than I imagined them to be. There were a couple of stories that I was originally considering that I don't think I will be anymore, because I thought that they were folklore, but I don't really know. They don't think that they are. They were told in my stories, my family as folklore. So there was a story called Little Black Sambo. Are you familiar with that story?
I'm familiar, but...
So it was told, my family is from West Texas. And so a lot of It was only told to me through storytelling, through oral storytelling. So I didn't realize that it was a physical book that was written by a woman who wrote it for her own children when she was an English woman living in India. So it's actually about a little Indian boy, and his mother is telling him, I think she sends him out somewhere, and he's wearing this beautiful outfit, but he comes across these tigers, and these tigers basically threaten to eat him if he doesn't give them something. And so he like basically starts taking off his clothing and gives them to the tigers each time he runs into one, until they start fighting over all of his beautiful clothing, and they run around a tree and they melt into butter. And I loved this story. It was one of my favorite stories growing up, until I started researching it in my folklore era, and because I thought it was just a folklore story, but it ends up being this story that has a lot of history that is not so great, in that it was very popular in the US until it was made. It was popular for a long time, but the illustrations that were done for it in the United States were blackface in a derogatory way. And so it was actually intended about Indian people, but they made it African Americans and more like slaves, and in the way that they did it in that past way that was very not kosher. They weren't nice illustrations. And so it was taken off the shelves for a long time because of that, mostly because of the illustrations, not for the story itself. And so for a while I was considering bringing it back and doing it in a way that was respectful, but I don't know if it's possible or not. And it's not really actually folklore, except for maybe in my family, because it was only told to me through oral storytelling, not through a book. But I'm not sure if it would be considered in the actual folklore realm. So just that was a long story to say that you have to consider all of the different historical contexts as well, and what meaning it had for a lot of people, which was not a good feeling for many people in the African American community.
That kind of learning wouldn't have happened without that research that you're talking about too. I'm curious, in your explorations with all of these different guests, did you have some stories that are incredibly memorable from your podcast guests that maybe have changed the course of how you want to do what you want to do?
One of my very first guests, Norma Elia Cantu, and I actually didn't realize that she lived in my city. She lives in San Antonio. For a while, she was the president of the American Folklore Society. She is a professor at Trinity University. I had her on talking about matachines, which is a prayer dance that happens in Spain, Mexico, and South Central of the United States. And it's primarily done at Christmas time, but it can be done in different times. And it's this performance requires a ton of traditional clothing. I almost said costuming, but she corrected me when it's not costuming, it's traditional clothing. And it really requires a whole community effort to put on this performance that lasts for sometimes days. And it's this kind of a glue that binds these communities together. And it was something that I had never heard of, but that was so central to many different places around the world. And so she talked a lot about that, and that was really eye-opening. And then also when I was telling her why I was starting the podcast, she was one of the very first guests I interviewed, and she was really supportive of my authoring folk tales for children, because she was of the mindset that it was not done enough, that the folk tales are not being passed on to the children enough today. And she thought that was such a great project, that I was bringing folklore to the masses and to children. And so that I found incredibly helpful for my heart and motivation for what I'm doing.
The replacement of folklore with what's in my background, right? The movies have replaced our storytelling by the fire to a large string.
But there's so much, there's something that you get from oral storytelling that you don't get from movies. And movies are beautiful. I love movies. And I think that we get so much from movies. They can move you to tears. I watched Wild Robot the other day. Have you seen that movie, Wild Robot?
I love that movie.
Oh my gosh. I was crying so hard. I was like, who did not tell me that this movie was going to make me, I was like pouring down tears. I was wiping my chest. I was crying so hard. Maybe it just speaks to parents, I think. It speaks, so strongly to parents. So there's so much beauty in film, but I think that there's a magic to oral storytelling that is sometimes lost when we don't do it and we don't hear it. And so one of the things that I am going to do now that I have all of my children in school, I am going to start doing storytelling in schools as long as they have the budget. That's my biggest concern right now, is that schools' budgets are being cut drastically. So I want to be doing storytelling in libraries, parks, and in schools. And so part of what I am going to be doing with authoring is that as well.
And that brings us back to podcasting as a way of letting people know about your books and your storytelling in schools. Do you have any advice that you want our audience to remember from your experience? Advice that might transcend podcasting or personal branding that you think people really need to take to heart before they start on a journey like this?
I think you need to understand your why. Because if you're just doing a podcast because it sounds fun, yes, it can be fun, but it's a lot of hard work. So if you don't have a why, then you're not going to keep going. You're going to be one of the people who stop at the 10 episodes because it's too much work for not enough reason. So you have to hold on to that why. If I didn't have my projects that I'm working on, I don't know that I would continue podcasting, because sometimes it feels like I'm talking into the void. Then I'm like, who is actually listening out there? And why am I talking to no one if I'm not getting the response that I want necessarily? So holding on to that why is really key in your motivation, but also not holding on to perfection, because we are not perfection. Like we're humans. We make mistakes, and people like to see other people make mistakes. They want to see other people stumbling as well, because then they're more willing to show you that they're stumbling as well, right? When we start showing our vulnerabilities, our mistakes, then we can actually be honest with each other and actually have true, heartfelt conversations. It's when we want to show the world that we're so smart, or we're so perfect, or we're so knowledgeable, we lose our ability to ask questions about being curious. Then we get stuck, right? So trying not to get stuck in those places where I have to only show my best side to everybody. That, I think, is absolutely key. Being willing to just stumble and fall flat on your face is part of the process.
That progress over perfection is so important for what we're doing.
Yeah.
Any last advice for our students who are just starting out?
I had someone to hold my hand. If you have a partner in crime, if you can find someone who's willing to help you along the way, I think that is incredibly helpful, because there's so many stumbling blocks that are easy to, stop at. And you find that it's difficult to pass over them, and you maybe think this is just going to be too hard. If you have someone who is holding you accountable, or saying, you know what, you can do this. I've seen what you're capable of, and I know that you can do it. Even if you just have a cheerleader, that is really helpful. Maybe find someone who, if you can find someone who wants to be your co-host, or someone who is practicing editing and wants to have that practice. Maybe you can just hire someone to do it for a few dollars, just so that they can get it on their portfolio as well and have that practice as well. Reaching out to the avenues that you might not necessarily use, and ask lots of questions. The podcasting groups can be really helpful. I asked so many questions when I was first starting out, and a lot of people would reach out. They would DM me, and I would find people who gave a lot of time. I had this one episode that had so many audio errors that I couldn't fix, and I couldn't figure out what to do. And I reached out on podcasting forums, and I was like, I don't know how to fix this. And someone was like, send it to me, I'll do it for you. And they did. And they didn't charge me. And it was just so nice. So there are so many kind individuals out there who are willing to lend a hand, and let them.
Where can people find this amazing folklore podcast that we've been talking about?
My website is www.fabricoffolklore.com, but you can look me up on any major podcasting platform. So if you listen to Spotify or Apple, iHeartRadio, any of the ones that you listen to, you can find Fabric of Folklore, like the weaving of fabric, the storytelling is woven together. That's the meaning behind Fabric of Folklore. Our lives are basically just a woven fabric of storytelling. So you can find me on Instagram, and YouTube as well.
So we're not looking for Vanessa Rogers. We're looking for Fabric of Folklore.
Yes, except for I do have my own personal YouTube channel that I started a long time ago that I think I might resurrect for my storytelling, because I'm going to be doing storytelling in schools. I want to have that as a separate brand. They're going to go hand in hand together. But maybe you can advise me as a brand master expert. I think that it's important, especially if I don't know, is this the right way to go, have a storytelling website and a podcasting website? What would you recommend for me, since I haven't built my storytelling website yet?
The advice for my discipline is always start with the audience. So do you want to be known as Vanessa Rogers Storyteller, or do you want Fabric of Folklore to be the thing that people are looking for?
First and foremost, probably an author. So probably
I would start channeling all of your energy into Vanessa Rogers, folklore expert, as your personal brand, the expert and the authority that we go to when we want to learn about folklore, as I have done today. Not just podcasting, obviously, but folklore. And that's the main focus. The Fabric of Folklore is still part of the business, but Vanessa Rogers is what you want to promote as. Are you looking to self-publish, or are you looking to work with a publisher?
It's faster and easier. Yeah, I can get more books out at one time.
Vanessa Rogers as the folklore authority, the personal brand is Vanessa Rogers. And a lot of times the social followings will help a publisher be attracted to say, Vanessa, we'd like to work with you and publish your book, because you have such a strong personal brand across multiple social platforms. That being said, it's not the only way. There are lots of ways to promote yourself. My advice would be say, who's my audience who want to have that experience of folklore and storytelling from an author with a voice that matters in that particular space. And you've done that with your podcast by establishing yourself as an authority in folklore already. So it's just a matter of pushing to those channels, those clips. And you've said you've already done that with YouTube Shorts, right?
Yeah.
Awesome.
My main message is not to be scared. It's scary to try new things, and it's scary to take on these grand projects, but I think it's worth it. So just do it.
And when you Google Vanessa Rogers, you will see that she is a folklore expert. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you sharing your wisdom.
Thanks so much, Ryan.